Hi and welcome back to my channel. In today's video I'm going to be talking about all the books that I read in the month of October. As I mentioned in my TBR video, I don't do spooky books, horror, thriller, stuff like that. So these are just going to be normal books. So the first few books that I have read this month are all books that were on my September TBR, but I got them done towards the beginning of October. The first of those, Project Mulberry by Linda Sue Park. I read quite a few of Linda Sue Park's books during the month of September and one in October, and her books ended up being hit or miss for me. None of them were terrible, but a couple of them were not great. And unfortunately, I'm going to lump Project Mulberry into the not great. This book was typical middle grades, fairly standard. The main character participated in a 4-H type program with her best friend, and they did a project on silkworms, hence the Project Mulberry, because silkworms eat mulberry leaves. Everything that she dealt with was just kind of normal, which, hey, that's great. But Linda Sue Park did this thing after each chapter where she had a conversation between herself and the main character. I didn't like that. Next we have The Magic of Ordinary Days. Now, in The Magic of Ordinary Days, I already knew the story because I have seen the fairly decent Hallmark film based on this book. I don't tend to like Hallmark movies, but I enjoyed this one. So I knew the basics of the plot, which I think added to my enjoyment of this book, because this is not a book about the plot. This is a book about the characters. Anne Howard Creel did a fairly decent job with developing the characters and developing the relationship between Livy and Ray, this not natural relationship, and I really enjoyed that. Unfortunately, I didn't rate this book super high, rated it average, because she never really resolves the relationship between Livy and Ray. She spends too much at the end of the book talking about the Rose and Lorelei, two other characters, saga, and then just Livy has a declaration of something she's realized, and voila, she never actually interacts with Ray again. So decent, but not great. Next we have Start Here, Start Now. This is one of the books that I read a few pages of a day, and I thoroughly enjoyed this one. Mentioned in my TBR that it's full of great practical tips. This is something that you really, if you're a teacher, you need to read this and you need to apply the things that Liz Kleinrock talks about in this book. It is phenomenal. Next we have How Rome Fell. This took a little bit longer to read. It is a bigger book, but I think it actually took me less time to read than a lot of the other nonfiction books I've read lately. I really enjoy Roman history. I took a class in grad school on the decline and fall of Rome, although I think it was the decline of Rome. I can't remember the exact title. And we studied much of the same things that were talked about in this book. So this book is very much like a textbook. I enjoy those. This one wasn't too dry. It talked about the things that led to the fall of the Roman Empire and how, unlike what other people have said, it wasn't just one, oh no, the barbarians have taken over type thing that led to the fall of Rome. It's not light reading, and most people probably wouldn't enjoy it, but as a history nerd, I loved it. So the next book I read this month was Wither, and I mentioned in my TBR that I was a little bit hesitant and wondered if it might not live up to any sort of expectations, or if it might just be part of the dystopian trend that hit around the 2010s. Yeah, it was one of those. I didn't really know what to make of the book because some parts of it were written well. I think DeStefano had a decent character in there and a decent, not decent, but interesting concept. Basically not decent at all. I was really put off by the whole scenario because one of the girls taken to be a sister wife in this whole dystopian world was only 13, and she's the one that gets pregnant, and the guy who's not necessarily the villain, but maybe he is the villain, 21, got some serious problems here. Everything seemed way too aged up. The response of people to this terrible scenario that is being faced in this world just didn't make sense. I just really didn't like it. Next, I read a short book that I absolutely loved, and I loved it for both the text and especially the illustrations, and that is Bilbo's Last Song. The illustrations are by the same woman who illustrated Chronicles of Narnia, and I just love that whimsy and what she puts into her illustrations. And each page has a set of illustrations on it. So this larger illustration on the page is something from the end of Lord of the Rings, where Bilbo is leaving Middle-earth. And then these small illustrations on the bottom of each page are scenes from The Hobbit. And I just loved how the illustrations tied in with the text itself. And for someone as obsessed with Lord of the Rings as I am, this is definitely a book I'm gonna have to get. And next we have Shark's Fin and Sichuan Pepper. I read this the day before I ran the Chicago Marathon. Took the day easy. Not the marathon day, obviously, but the day before. I loved Fuchsia Dunlop's exploration of her time in China. She's not Chinese. She went there, she studied there, she fell in love with the culture, she fell in love with the food, and through that, developed a career that she didn't expect. She's a food writer. She's published multiple cookbooks, especially centering on Chinese cuisine and the different parts of Chinese cuisine in these different areas, and she gets into the culture and how closely food is tied with the culture. She even talks about how she reached a point where she thought, wait, have I grown out of love with this? And she works her way through this. And I bring up that I read it the day before the Chicago Marathon because the Chicago Marathon, which I love, goes through a bunch of different neighborhoods, and I probably just didn't remember it from when I ran it 4 years ago, but immediately I thought of this book when we turned into Chinatown, and I just thought it was the coolest thing. When I talked about this book on my TBR, I expressed concern that I might not like this book just because of how I've fallen out of favor with the Christian fiction genre. Based on the reading of this book, I'm not making any qualifications about Christian nonfiction based on this book, just because I don't think it was that great of a book. For the first part, it does not live up to the subtitle. The subtitle says How Atheism Led Me to Faith. Hitchens splits this book into 3 parts, roughly. And in the first part, he talks about what a rebellious boy he was as a kid and how, as a young adult, he got into rather, I don't know, political stuff, atheist stuff, and then, I actually am going to go back to all of the Anglicanism of my youth, and I'm not going to tell you how that happened. It just did. The middle section, I don't actually remember that much from it, and then the last section bored me to pieces. He set up the last portion as a direct contradiction to people like his brother, Christopher Hitchens. But he made no argument that actually against them. And you can't really logically argue about things about faith. But he ends up spending the last third of this book, published in 2010, a couple decades after the fall of the Soviet Union, talking about the Soviet Union and communism. It's like he has an axe to grind with communism, and you're reading the last bit going, huh? Next we have The End of Your Life book club. I loved this book. While reading it, was trying to think of a way that I would describe it. It took a little bit of time for me to figure out, but then I realized it's a love letter from a son to a mother. He, in this book, chronicles his mother's last days, but he doesn't go into copious descriptions of this like another end-of-life cancer memoir that I've read, The Unwinding of the Miracle. He talks about this time that he spent with his mother being able to spend this time with her and learning more about her as a person through the books that they're reading. And he talks about different things from her past, and he paints this beautiful portrait of his mother through her last 18 or so months. And I just absolutely loved it. So the next book that I read this month, probably one of my favorite books of the month. No, actually my favorite book of the month. One of my favorites all year. One of the best books I have ever read. I didn't know what to expect going into it. And I knew that this had something to do with a character who was in a Japanese internment camp. Not an internment camp, a Japanese concentration camp, like a camp run by the Japanese in Asia. And my mind said something about Korea, probably because I had just recently read that YA book that was set during that time. But this book actually takes place in Malaya, or what we know today as Malaysia. And the main character, Yun Ling, is the lone survivor of a camp. A secret camp that there aren't very many records or any records of. And she is dealing with the trauma that came from that, and then also how she processed it and events that happened in her life shortly thereafter. Throughout the story, it's told through the perspective of Yun Ling as she is an old woman. Well, I say old woman, but she's, I think, her 60s, late 60s. She has just retired as a judge in Malaysia, and she doesn't tell anyone. But the reason that she retired is because she has this degenerative aphasia that will eventually steal her ability to read, to speak, and her memories. She wants to go back to this very important place to tell those stories, to write them down, to figure things out before she loses that ability. This book is told in then and now in various ways, a few different points in Yun Ling's life. The author never gives like the specific 20 years ago or whatever signposts. Normally I really dislike it when that happens, but it worked so well in this book. She tells of the time where shortly a few years after the war, early 50s, she had been working as a lawyer, a prosecutor in the same system that she eventually became a judge. But because she would not go along with things that were happening, she was fired. And she eventually goes to what becomes known as the Garden of the Evening Mists, that area, to build a Japanese style garden for her sister. Both she and her sister were interned at the same camp, and since she was the only survivor, her sister perished in that camp, and her sister was obsessed with Japanese gardens. And through that, she meets a man, a Japanese man who'd been living in this area in Malaya for years, and he had formerly been the gardener for Hirohito, the emperor. The story that she tells and weaves together with these other characters, because there's a character who is a Boer, a South African of Dutch descent, who lost family in internment camps that the British put on in South Africa. She tells of the story of what happened to this other, the Japanese gardener. I struggle to come up with adequate words to describe just how beautiful this book is. I finished it. It's one of those books where you so enjoy it and it leaves you with that book hangover, that good book hangover, that you're like, I don't know if I want to pick up anything else because this book was so good. Next, I read another book that I picked up at that book sale that I described really early on in the channel. I try to finish a book on Saturday and Sunday of the weekends so I can meet my goals, and because I had enjoyed the Garden of the Evening Mist so much, I needed one that I could quickly knock off. This is one of them. It's one of the movie scrapbooks. I think there's a few other that the publisher put out. It's for Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. This one is Newt Scamander. There's not too much groundbreaking in this book. It was a fun read. I love looking at the different pictures and memorabilia and things that they put in the book. The text, honestly, not that great, kind of generic, but I loved it and I probably will keep everything Harry Potter related. Next we have Una ruga en el tiempo. I have been reading this for a little over a month. I read a few pages every day to help with my Spanish fluency. I have mentioned before that Madeleine L'Engle and the Wrinkle in Time series is not my favorite, but I wanted to give this a try for the format and, you know, just to see if I might appreciate it more. And I will say I did appreciate this format more. I think that the illustrator did a really good job. I actually saw one of my students reading this book, but the English translation version. So this has been done in both English and Spanish. Again, still, I am not a fan of the book. I'm not a fan of the book. It leaves a lot to be desired. There's a lot that doesn't honestly make sense. Some of the connections with the characters are kind of like, I don't understand this. But it was an easy read. I think the translation was well done. The illustrations are really good. They're a bit simplistic, but they're pretty good. With this book, I finished my October TBR. Now, I will admit that the Newt Scamander book that I referenced just a little bit ago, not on my TBR, I just picked it up. It was not on my official TBR. It's in my TBR piles on my shelves, but that was extra. But with this book, I finished my October TBR with a few days remaining in the month. I obviously had a really good reading month. Now, when I read the back of this and realized that it was a steampunk zombie book, I'm not a huge fan of zombies. I don't really have anything against them. They're just not my favorite. Also, I'm really not into horror and creepy stuff, so I wondered if I would like this book or if I would DNF it, and I gave myself that option. Now, I did finish it. I will say that the zombies, the rotters as they call them, not actually all that creepy. There's like one or two, maybe 3 scenes where they actually make appearances and they're not just mentioned, where you hear them off in the distance. So that part was kind of like, eh. Then you have 2 different POVs. You have Zeke Wilkes, the son, and you have Briar Wilkes, the mom. And the son wants to rehab his father's reputation because his father was an inventor who let loose this machine onto the city and like stole money from banks, but also opened up this vein of blight gas, which is what turned the people into the rotters, into the zombies. So that's his goal. So he goes into the city, but then there's an earthquake. Conveniently, there's an earthquake that closes down the way under the wall that people of Seattle have built. And so the mom, who had figured that out, was waiting for him. She's like, oh no, I gotta get him out. And so she finds an airship and goes over, and there's like, whoa, chaos, trying to find each other, and like 50 billion characters introduced. Yeah, it's kind of like, eh. I thought I was gonna give this an average rating, but then the end just sucked so much. The way they dispatched the villain. Oh yeah. Conveniently, villain's dead. Huh? So I was gonna give it 3 stars as average, but it knocked it down to 2.5. This was like, eh. Okay, not reading anything else but like this again. So then I picked up 2 books that were on my physical TBR stacks to not get into what I put for my November TBR. And honestly, I also wanted to completely finish a couple books before November started, since November starts on a Monday. And the books that I have on November's TBR, as you saw last week, they're big. So I picked a couple different ones so that I could finish them. The first of those that I picked up, I've actually owned for a couple years. I don't know how long. I knew I wanted to get it, and I knew that I wanted to read it and then put it in my classroom library. and that is Speak by Laurie Halse Anderson. Laurie Halse Anderson is one of my favorite YA authors. She does such a good job with what she does. I mean, it's fantastic. And this book especially is just so gut-wrenching. And when I saw that it was a graphic novel, I knew that I had to have it. And so I read that, and I read it in about an hour because it is quicker to get through graphic novels. What a gut punch. The illustrations in this book, they're gorgeous. They are heartbreaking. They fit so well with Halse Anderson's text. She did update it for the times because this was published in 2018. She did update it because the book was originally written in the 90s, and so she put in some more modern things like with social media and things like that that fit with Melinda's story. I struggle. I lack words. The illustrations are just phenomenal. This book makes me want to get more into graphic novels because the interplay between words and illustrations, you can do so much when you combine the words and the illustrations. Is just incredible. So I had time this month for one more book, and after Speak, I needed something lighthearted and easy to get through. So there's another book that has been on my physical TBR for a while, and that is Feel Good Fitness by Alicia Montano. I follow Alicia Montano on Instagram. She's an amazing runner. She's a huge advocate for people treating mothers right. She's just an amazing person. And because I follow her Instagram, I saw when this book was coming out last year, all the talk about it and different things like that, and I thought, I really want to get this. It's mostly different exercises and things. There's not a lot of text, so I did read this very quickly. I don't think I'll do all of these challenges because it does seem geared towards people just getting into fitness, or maybe people average everyday, maybe like moms, short on time or something like that. But there are some really good routines like strength training and things like this that I'm definitely going to incorporate into my routine. And I just really enjoyed this, and seeing all the illustrations and the really well done descriptions of how to complete these different movements. Definitely recommend this one. And so that completes my October wrap up. I read a lot of really cool books, and I had such a good reading month. A reading month that made me put quite a few books on my November TBR, maybe to be a little over ambitious. Let me know in the comments which of these books you have read. Do you have different thoughts than I did? I'd love to discuss these with you in the comments. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.